It's 2018. Alec Wilson is flying a helicopter on approach to Vancouver's low airspace, a route he's flown maybe 100 times now. And then he sees it. A drone. Small, consumer grade, completely out of place in a corridor where manned aircraft operate, and flown, he strongly suspects, by someone who has no idea he's coming. Alec doesn't crash. Nothing dramatic happens in this story. But Alec does remember this moment because of how he felt about it. Not exactly scared, fascinated. Because that drone wasn't supposed to be capable of being there yet. Not technically, not really. And yet. Welcome to the Drone Network, the only podcast in the air and on the airwaves. I'm your host, Bryce Bladen, and on this show we document the tech, economics, and people piloting the world's largest standardized drone imagery network. Each episode, we explore how drones are reshaping industries, creating new economic opportunities, and literally changing how we see the world. On today's episode, the number that made all this possible. It's not $1 billion R&D budget, it's not a visionary founder, it's not even a patent. It's a weight. 249 grams. And the story of how it got there is a little bit stranger and a lot more consequential than you might expect. Let's start with how aviation regulation actually works. It's very relevant to the story we're about to tell. Regulators, as a rule, don't usually get ahead of technology. They respond to it. A new kind of aircraft shows up, incidents happen or get anticipated, and then committees argue about what the rules should be. The drone era was no different. I personally experienced this with those NFTs everyone hates in 2017 when I was speaking to the BCSC prior to releasing something called the RC721, i.e. the first mainstream NFT, and trying to explain that to regulators before it was live and what the impact would be was... I was going to say an uphill battle, but it's arguably a battle I picked too soon. I was trying to be responsible. My team was trying to be as responsible as possible. But again, how regulations work is challenging, especially when you do try to get ahead of them with the technology. Let's talk about this in the context of consumer drones, though. When consumer drones started proliferating in the early 2010s, aviation authorities worldwide had a problem. These things weren't like any previous aircraft category. They were cheap enough to buy on a whim. They were easy enough to fly that people with no aviation background were doing it. They were small enough that you could lose one in a tree, and capable enough to cause real problems near airports, stadiums, near anything where you're not necessarily supposed to be flying. The question was, how do you regulate something like this? Something this distributed? You can't license every weekend hobbyist the way you can a commercial pilot. You can't subject a $400 toy to the same airworthiness standards as a Cessna. So they ran tests. They fired drones into things, windshields, rotor systems, soft targets, to understand what weight thresholds corresponded to what injury risk. And a number kept coming up. 250 grams. Below that weight, the risk profile changed enough that regulators in Canada, the US, the UK, and most of the developed world converged on the same threshold, under 250 grams. Minimal registration requirements, no need for certification to fly in many controlled areas, dramatically simplified airspace access. The regulatory burden drops off a cliff at that line. Now here's the thing. Nobody designing that regulation was thinking about a global aerial data network. They were thinking about liability. They were thinking about airport safety. They were thinking about not getting yelled at by airlines. But that number had an effect that nobody really planned for. DJI, which, in case you haven't been listening to the show, makes up about 84% of all civilian drones on the Earth right this second, read the regulatory landscape, and they built for it. The Mavic Mini released in 2019 at a whopping 249 grams. The Mini 2, the Mini 3, the Mini 4 Pro, all 249 grams. 1 gram of margin, engineered deliberately. What DJI understood was that weight wasn't just a spec, it was a key to a market. A sub 250 gram drone doesn't just weigh less, it occupies a fundamentally different regulatory category. It can fly in places heavier drones can't. It can be operated by people who never passed a full pilot certification, at least outside of the US. It could be sold to millions of consumers who'd balk at the complexity of heavier, more in-depth platforms. And it's that drone, specifically that 249-gram drone in that weight class, that's what the Layer Drone Network runs on. This is not a coincidence. It's infrastructure logic. Alec Wilson and the Spexy team needed a drone that thousands of independent operators could own, carry in a backpack, fly in cities, and operate without a commercial license in most jurisdictions. The 249-gram mini-series is the only hardware that checks all of those boxes simultaneously. Take away that 250-gram threshold, and the network as it exists doesn't work. Not because the technology isn't there, but because the regulatory overhead would price the casual operator out of this. The retired firefighter, the photography hobbyists, the person who just wants to get outside and earn a little extra on their Saturday. One regulatory footnote made this entire network possible. So, let's talk about infrastructure. Infrastructure is usually built on purpose. The interstate highway system was a deliberate project. The internet backbone, ARPANET, then everything after, that was funded, architected, argued over. The GPS satellite constellation costs the US government somewhere around $12 billion. These things exist because someone decided they should exist, and then they did the work to build them. The Layer Drone Network did not work like that. What it did instead is borrow infrastructure that already existed, distributed across real estate photography, YouTube content, curiosity. The hardware was out there. The pilots were certified or became certified for their own purposes. The network didn't have to build any of that. It had to coordinate it. If this pattern sounds familiar, it should. It's the same logic that built the YouTube creator ecosystem, the Airbnb supply base, the Uber driving network. The platform didn't manufacture the supply, it organized supply that already existed by adding an economic incentive on top of an existing behavior. In this case, people were already flying drones. Spexy and Layer Drone said, what if you got paid for it? What if you flew standardized missions and contributed to something larger? What they were really doing was making the infrastructure legible. The drones were already there. The regulatory framework that made them viable was already there. The missing piece was coordination, a way to turn dispersed hardware into a coherent data collection network. And that's what the platform provides. And ironically, none of it required building the underlying infrastructure from scratch. Let me make a comparison to this. Stay with me. The Global Positioning System, GPS, built by the US military, operated for decades as a military asset with a deliberate accuracy limitation baked in for civilian use, what they called selective availability. You could basically introduce a random error of about 100 meters into any civilian GPS reading. You could locate yourself, roughly. You just couldn't do precision navigation. In 2000, the year 2000, the Clinton administration turned selective availability off. Full GPS accuracy, suddenly available to anyone with a receiver. People who made that decision weren't thinking about Uber. They were not thinking about Pokemon Go. They were not thinking about agricultural precision equipment or delivery routing algorithms or any of the thousands, if not tens of thousands of applications that now depend on accurate GPS. They made a policy decision. And those consequences metastasized outward for decades. The 250-gram threshold is a smaller version of this. It's a technical boundary set for narrow safety reasons that became the enabling condition for something much larger than the people who drew the line originally intended. Now, I don't want to end this by making it all sound inevitable and sturdy and concrete, because it isn't. That 250-gram threshold is not permanent. Regulators revisit these frameworks as drone technology advances, heavier drones getting safer, new sensor types, higher autonomy. The risk calculus that produced the 249-gram sweet spot will be rerun. The line might move. The exceptions and exemptions might narrow. But then there's DJI. 84% of global civilian drone market share is held by a single company based in Shenzhen, China. It's not a story of resilience. The Layer Drone Network's operational hardware, almost all of it runs on DJI. That is the network's greatest current advantage because DJI makes exceptional products, and its biggest latent risk, because of geopolitical events, trade restrictions, or regulatory decisions about Chinese technology in sensitive data applications, could change that picture fast. US government has already placed DJI on the entity list. Certain procurement restrictions exist for federal agencies. The current consumer market hasn't really been materially affected yet, but yet is doing a lot of work in that previous sentence. I don't say this to be alarmist. The trajectory here is still very positive. But there's a difference between infrastructure that was built on purpose and infrastructure assembled around regulation and the dominance of one manufacturer. The latter is faster to build and harder to defend. Here's how I'm coming to think about all of this. The most important infrastructure is usually the kind that didn't mean to be. GPS wasn't built to power the app economy. The internet wasn't built for streaming video. The 249-gram drone weight limit wasn't written with a global aerial data network in mind. But what's possible isn't determined by what's intended. It's determined by what conditions exist. The right hardware at the right price in the right regulatory environment with the right coordination layer on top. Suddenly, you have something that functions as infrastructure, even if nobody planned it that way. And that's what I think is happening here. Not that Spexy or Lair Drone built infrastructure. It's that they looked at what the regulatory environment and consumer hardware market had accidentally made possible, and then they built a coordination layer on top of it. Alec Wilson's drone dodging helicopter story is funny in retrospect, but it's also the moment before the system became legible, when the pieces were already in place and someone smart enough to see the shape of it so that they could start paying attention. It's also worth noting that Alec Wilson, following the story of nearly crashing his helicopter into a drone, actually helped set some of those regulations as part of his previous business prior to joining Spexy Geospatial. Likewise, I wouldn't be surprised if Bill had some sort of knowledge, the CEO of Spexy, as part of helping to capture Google Maps and Google Earth imagery with those planes. Regardless, I've been Bryce Bladen. This is the Drone Network, and thank you so much for listening. Thanks for being a part of the Drone Network. Subscribe wherever fine podcasts are served to get a new episode every week. And remember to leave us a 5-star review on your podcast app of choice. It helps a lot. Today's show was sponsored by Spexy Geospatial and Lair Drone. Learn more about standardized drone imagery built for global scale at spexy.com, that's spexi.com, and lairdrone.org. Thanks again for listening.